Okay, situating us. It is the 25th of June, 2025, and I'm still in my little room. It's still there, and this is going to be a little bit clunky today. We're going to be looking at psychological types by surprise, surprise, Mr. Carl Jung that I've been reading lately, and it's going to be a bit edity because I'm going to be stopping to find what I want to talk about. I'm going to try and go through it. I've not finished it, but I'm wanting to catch up my understanding. So essentially going to go right into it. Or Psychological Types was first published in um 1921, and during his intense period of creating the Red Book between sort of 1911 and 1918, um the genesis of Psychological Types really came out of that work. And so it's sort of one of his pretty much his first attempt to publicly communicate what what had happened to him. And that sort of mostly culminates in chapter 5 when he talks about the uniting symbol as connected with the transcendent function that then became a part of his discussions of the individuation process and the emergence of the self. And so sort of uses the type problem, what he calls the type problem, as a way to explore historical dualism in Western culture, um, like in terms of introversion and extraversion, let's say. And he uses that to talk about the significance of symbols and their uniting function for him cross-culturally. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. Skipping through the forward and finding. Yeah, so the first chapter is the problem of types in the history of classical and medieval thought. And Jung uses the problem of types in terms of introversion and extroversion to more or less go through this historical split or duality in the Western psyche from a very long time ago. Um, so not at all, I'm not going to read a lot, I don't think. So Jung has a sort of coming out of history model where he talks about Levi-Bruhl's participation mystique, where all of the subject and object were wrapped up together in a sort of unity. And for Jung, this is also connected with our own individual development, where in both historical, so phylogenetic, and individual, so ontogenetic development, the ego differentiates itself out of the collectivity by withdrawing its projections upon objects and so forming itself as a subject. This is Jung's model of development that he's working with. So first of all, in terms of Western culture, Jung starts off by sort of, as Western culture has sort of developed itself out of this prehistorical participation mystique or unity of subject and object, the differentiation of what Jung calls individual consciousness, or we could say modern consciousness from that point. Well, there were dualities that developed. The obvious question is, which kind of dualities is Jung talking about? We're obviously going to get into introversion and extroversion in a bit following Jung, but at the first point, he's talking about this historical opposition between Gnosticism and Christianity, where um, if we imagine these qualities of thinking, feeling, and sensation, which were important to each one, in Christianity, Jung saying that love and faith were more important to the Christians, which have more of a quality of feeling and sensation. And so there, he's saying that Christianity had a sort of historical devaluation of knowledge in comparison to Gnosticism, which was far more about um, going up. Um, why is it about going up? I don't know. There was a he's claiming that there was in within Gnosticism a an emphasis on the possession of knowledge that was not the same in Christianity, and that this I think Gnosticism is very much like ascent, getting out of this world, so ascending up, and in that way, there's yeah, they're sort of the Gnostic normativity, if you like, sort of where to go, what to do in Gnosticism is mirrored in their relationship to the functions within the body. So there's a valuation on thinking and knowledge, which is sort of from here, if you like. It's up comparatively with as compared to Christian principles, which talk about, let's say, love and faith, is you don't need to ascend and have divine knowledge in order to have love and faith. And so there's a typological difference, which is reflected in the historical opposition between Gnosticism and Christianity. This is all according to Jung. And yeah, he's saying that there was a predominantly practical trend in early Christianity, um, much less about sort of esoteric mystery schools and getting up and out of here, and much more about the common man and like mm, in a way it's a much more practical and in a sense democratic religiosity. And Jung then he says the intellectual was much worse hit by the sacrifice of the intellect than the feeling type. It's therefore understandable that the vastly superior intellectual content of gnosis, which in the light of our present mental development is not lost but has considerably gained in value, must have made the greatest possible appeal to the intellectual within the church. So he's saying that the this Gnosticism's emphasis on quote unquote knowledge was appealing to the intellectuals in the early Christian church, for which reason such intellectuals, namely Origen and Tertullian, form interesting objects of study for Jung, because if we look at how these early Christian intellectuals came to reject Gnosticism in favor of Christianity, it could be revealing of uh, in the split within the Western psyche and origins of such, which Jung wishes to talk about. So from that place, he says, perhaps the struggle with gnosis is most vividly presented to us in two figures who were of the utmost significance, not only as church fathers, but as personalities, Tertullian and Origen, who lived towards the end of the second century. Um, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Tertullian and Origen, and at least in Jung's terms. Jung thinks of Tertullian as a classic example of introverted thinking, who, page 13, quote, thanks to the acuteness of his mind, he saw through the poverty of philosophical and Gnostic knowledge and contemptuously rejected it. He invoked against it the testimony of his own inner world, his own inner realities, which were one with his faith. In shaping and developing these realities, he became the creator of those abstract conceptions which still underlie the Catholic system of today. The irrational inner reality had for him an essentially dynamic nature. It was his principle, his foundation in the face of the world and of all collectively valid and rational science and philosophy. I quote in his own words, Tertullian's words, I summon a new witness, or rather a witness more known than any written monument, more debated than any system of life, more published abroad than any promulgation, greater than the whole of man, yea, that which constitutes the whole of man. Approach then, O my soul, whether you be something divine and eternal, as many philosophers believe, the less then will you lie, or not wholly divine, because mortal, as Epicurus alone contends. The less then ought you to lie. Whether you come from heaven or are born of earth, whether compounded of numbers or of atoms, whether you have your beginning with the body or are later joined to it, what matter indeed whence you come and how you make man to be what he is, a reasonable being capable of perception and of knowledge. But I summon you not, O soul, as proclaiming wisdom, trained in the schools, conversant with libraries, fed and nourished in the academies and pillared halls of Athens. No, I would speak with you, O soul, as wondrous, simple, and unlearned, awkward and inexperienced, such as you are for those who possess nothing else but you, even as you come from the alleys, from the street corners, and from the workshops. It is just your unknowingness that I need. That was from Tertullian. Jung says the self-mutilation performed by Tertullian in the sacrifice of the intellect, um, so Tertullian's devaluation of his own intellect, led him to an unqualified recognition of the irrational inner reality, the true rock of his faith. the necessity of the religious process which he sensed in himself. He crystallized in the incomparable formula anima naturaliter Christiana, meaning the soul is by nature Christian. With the sacrifice of the intellect, philosophy, and science, and hence also gnosis, fell to the ground. This is for Tertullian, and who was, as Jung said, critical in the development of the early Christian church. Jung talks about Origen as sort of the opposite. So, where Tertullian is a classic example of introverted thinking, Origen is a classic example of extroverted feeling, or at least an extrovert. And I will also quote from Origen for the sake of equality. Yeah, indeed, this is page 15. Indeed, judging by his thought and fundamental views, he was himself almost a Christian Gnostic. His position in regard to faith and knowledge is described by Harnack in the following psychologically significant words from Origen regarding faith and knowledge. The Bible is equally needful to both. The believers recite from it the facts and commandments they need, while the Gnostics decipher thoughts in it and gather from it the powers which guide them to the contemplation and love of God, whereby all material things, through spiritual independent interpretation, allegorical exegesis, hermeneutics, seem to be melted into a cosmos of ideas, until at last everything is surmounted and left behind as a stepping stone, while only this remains, the blessing and abiding relationship of the God-created creaturely soul to God. And so, yes, whereas Origen castrated himself, and so as a sort of opposite of Tertullian, Tertullian was led away from thinking and towards the irrationality of faith, whereas Origen was led away from feeling and toward the intellect, both in service of the defense of the early Christian church. Although, importantly, Tertullian ended up going to do his own thing, creating his own school, sect. Yeah, and so Jung says, yeah, of Origen, by mutilating himself, he sacrificed his sensual tie to the world. For him, evidently, the specific danger was not the intellect, but feeling and sensation, which bound him to the object. Through castration, he freed himself from the sensuality that was coupled with Gnosticism. He could then surrender without fear to the treasures of Gnostic thought. Whereas Tertullian, through his sacrifice of the intellect, turned away from gnosis, but also reached a depth of religious feeling that we miss in Origen. And so Jung says, we see here how in the Christian process, the original type has actually become reversed. Tertullian, the acute thinker, becomes a man of feeling, while Origen becomes the scholar and loses himself in intellectuality. So he's saying that each of them has a sort of original nature, which they rejected in a certain sense and went in a different direction. Um, Tertullian is classically a very has a lot of feeling within him, but then orients toward intellectuality, whereas Origen, wait, sorry, it should be the other way around, excuse me. Um, Tertullian has a brilliant mind, but orients himself towards the irrationality of faith, so towards feeling and sensation, whereas Origen um, becomes a scholar and moves away from his sort of um, more base nature, you could say. On page 19, Jung talks about the sacrifice that each of these thinkers made, these early Christian thinkers, Tertullian and Origen. And what he's talking about is a sort of an aspect of the developmental process where a person who's had a very one-sided development, sort of, and again, these guys are like great thinkers, right? So they have like a maybe over-reliance on one functional capacity that they have, which is then sort of counteracted by a compensation which shows up at a certain point where there's a shift in the flow of their natural energy, or what Jung calls libido, into the development into a sacrifice, which showed up for each of them differently. So again, Origen sacrificed his feeling and Tertullian sacrificed his intellect in a certain way. Um, and they sort of went in a different direction than their original typology would have implied. And each of these different developmental pathways, if you like, could find a home within the auspices of the early Christian church, um, which, as Jung says on page 19, the sacrifice that Tertullian and Origen carried out was drastic, too drastic for our taste, but it was in keeping with the spirit of the age, which was thoroughly concretistic. Because of this spirit, the Gnostics took their visions as absolutely real, or at least as relating directly to reality. And for Tertullian, the reality of his feeling was objectively valid. The Gnostics projected their subjective inner perception of the change of attitude into a cosmogonic system and believed in the reality of its psychological figures. Um, Jung is essentially talking about how the attitude that was present in Gnosticism could sort of find a way through Tertullian and Origen to be part of Christianity without the need to retain Gnosticism itself. So that then leads us into um, this discussion of how these two different types can show up within the early Christian church. Um, yeah, where he's talking about a certain kind of split, an early split within the church that then showed up later on. So at the moment, he's been talking about how each of these different personality types, which represent different sides of this split, could um, sort of be converted to Christianity and then find a home there despite their deep differences. We're now in part two of the first chapter on page 20, which is called The Theological Disputes of the Ancient Church. He talks about one of the main differences being, discussion of the complete identity with God versus of Christ. Is Christ identical to God, or is Christ simply similar to God? Where the second, just being similar, seems to put the emphasis on the sensuous and humanly perceptible, in contrast to the absolute identity, which seems to emphasize the purely conceptual and abstract. So this is a connection here between the abstract and or the mental and unity, whereas the sensual or the embodied is connected with multiplicity. So the similarity, but not identity, between Christ and God. Um, Yep. So he talks about this is page 21, talks about a great psychological schism within the early church. Quote, the one position attaches supreme value and importance to the sensuously perceptible, whose subject, though it may not always be human and personal, is nevertheless always a projected human sensation. The other maintains that the chief value lies with the abstraction extrahuman, whose subject is the function. In other words, with the objective process of nature that runs its course determined by impersonal law beyond human sensation, of which it is the actual foundation. And what he's saying here is basically constructing a huge dichotomy and that he can then analyze within the early church. And this is sort of towards, so these different categories, this dualism is sort of between the abstract, the unnatural or transcendent, unity toward rationality, toward the superhuman, toward the impersonal, and towards thinking, where Origen is moving in that direction. Which is contrasted with the other category, which has to do with orientation towards the sensory, toward the natural, toward the multiple, toward the irrational, toward the human or personal, and toward feeling. So it's sort of abstraction versus sensation, unnatural versus natural, unity versus multiplicity, rational versus irrational, superhuman versus human, or suprapersonal versus personal, and thinking versus feeling. Yeah, where both exemplars of these. This is sort of a heaven and earth, um, higher and lower kind of categorization. And he talks about in relation to Origen and Tertullian, um, Origen by nature, an extrovert, orients towards the heaven, the more abstract oriented category, as a way of compensating for his natural deficit, for his over reliance on his extraversion. Whereas Tertullian, by nature an introverted thinker, compensates for his introverted thinking by moving toward the lower category that has to do with like talking a lot, for example, about the irrational and about the feelings and sensation and that sort of thing. I hope that is clear. So now we're going to be working with this basic dichotomy within the early Christian church and talking about it. So he talks about another aspect of this type conflict, which shows up, for example, in what he calls the Pelagian controversy at the beginning of the 5th century. So this is the origin of the doctrine of original sin. So the idea that it's an experience profoundly felt by Tertullian was that was that man cannot avoid sin even after baptism. And so in this scheme of things, the value of man stands very low. So he's really nothing, quote, this is really nothing but a miserable, rejected creature who's delivered over to the devil under all circumstances, unless through the medium of the church, the sole means of salvation, he's made a participator in of the divine grace. Not only man's value, but his moral freedom and his self-determination crumbled away accordingly, with the result that the value and significance of the church as an idea was so much the more enhanced, as was altogether in keeping with Augustine's explicit program in Civitas Dei. Yeah, so because Augustine inherited this sort of emphasis on original sin and really developed it, because over against it there was the redeeming grace of God and the institution of the church, ordained by God's grace to administer the means of salvation. So this devaluation of the human, of the personal, of everything weak and small and lowly and limited and um, lowly about man is one side of a particular personality type. Or it's not just a personality type though, a general orientation toward the nature of the human, of the real. And so there would obviously we would want to see was associated with Tertullian. So I guess the implication is that um it's sort of devaluation of the human. And against that, I'm not clear which of those categories it fits into, but anyway, that's not the most important thing. So I'm going to move on to what sort of set up against that, which is Jung calls it a sort of stifling conception. So it's a very important part of the early church, this original sin, as we know, and like that with Augustine in Civitas Dei, which I think is a publication by Augustine, there's like really critical parts of the development of the early church. We set up the authority of God and the authority of the church as a means of salvation, sole means of salvation. Um, so this would be connected with everything that's high. So this is evaluation of the superpersonal. So in this case, God, and devaluation of the personal. So Tertullian is someone who felt this very strongly, but it was actually expressed more by the type that originated with the sort that Origen represents. So this sort of the thinkers of the church, the church's orientation toward the unity within God, toward the unnatural, the supernatural, superhuman within God, giving rise to this overbearing, overarching authority of the church, as against which the personal, the human, is regarded lowly and devalued. Against Jung then says on page 22, against such a stifling conception, there rises ever anew the feeling of man's freedom and moral value, a feeling that will not long endure suppression, whether by insight, however searching, or logic, however keen. Yeah, the rightness of the feeling of human value found its defenders in Pelagius, a British monk, and Celestius, his pupil. Their teaching was founded on the moral freedom of man as a given fact. So it's the sort of origins of the ideas that then show up later in the Enlightenment and in democracy of man's freedom and man's moral value. So this was felt, but we want to say this has a sort of there's something Gnostic or pagan about that, which was sort of repressed by the doctrines that we were just talking about of original sin. Uh, Jung makes a connection here that there's also someone named who's significant named Nestorius, and he stressed the separation of the two natures of Christ. So the connection here is that we talked about the doctrine of original sin, which was associated with the upper category that I named, which had to do with abstract, superhuman, rational, unified, unnatural, and thinking. And so the doctrine of original sin fits in with that. What it also fits in with that is the unity between Christ and God, so the identity between Christ and God. Whereas the other category, again, the other type within the early church has to do with the valuation of the sensory, the natural, the multiple, the irrational, the human, the personal, and feeling. What fits in with that is um, a feeling of man's freedom and man's moral value as against the doctrine of the original sin. And it also fits in with the similarity between Christ and God versus their identity. So that they're not identical, they're not the same. So this fits in with the multiplicity thing. And the reason of this guy, Nestorius, stressed that separateness of the two different natures of Christ, which is why he was important. But he also importantly didn't want Mary, Mother Mary, to be understood as the bearer of God, rather just the bearer of Christ. Um, so that was also part of his agenda. So we're now going to talk about a different form that this opposition of types, of a different form of how it showed up in the early church. We're skipping ahead to the 9th century. We were talking about the 5th century, and we're on page 23. We're going to talk about the problem of transubstantiation. So this is the idea that it's associated with Christ, right? Where there's a doctrine. There was a guy, Radbertus, who first proposed the doctrine of transubstantiation with a treatise on communion. And so he is the guy that sort of originated this assertion that the wine and the holy wafer that is eaten in the church ritual, the communion ritual, I guess it is. I'm not as educated as I should be. He argued that this wine and holy wafer became transformed into the actual blood and body of Christ. So this is an argument that like this transformation, this transubstantiation of Christ is in truth, is in reality, is in substance. It actually is his body, his flesh and blood. And this was opposed by Erigena, who was quite one of the great philosophers and daring thinkers of the early Middle Ages. Origena was important as one of the only sort of original thinkers of his age who sort of towered above everyone else in his time. He got butchered by his own monks around the year 889, which is unfortunate because he set reason above authority, which might have contributed. So that's why people like Origena as someone who's sort of defying authority for the sake of rationality, let's say. And he also held, therefore, that the communion was nothing more than a commemoration of the Last Supper, which Jesus celebrated with his disciples. And so, yeah, he was a logical and rational thinker. The other thinker we were talking about, Radbertus, who couldn't think as well. So Jung says, who assuredly could not think. He emphasized the transubstantiation as a symbolic and meaningful identity with Christ, who is Jung says was therefore more oriented toward the spirit of his age. But again, this is the basic dispute that we've already been discussing, where the abstract standpoint, here represented by Erigena, um, abhors any contamination with the concrete object. So it's Christ who's significant, and it's just a symbol that we eat the wine and the wafer. Whereas the concretistic standpoint, the standpoint more oriented towards sensation, toward the earth rather than heaven, is turned toward the object and says, no, it is actually the blood and body of Christ. This is another expression of the same split within the church in the 9th century. Yeah, so in relation to these different types, which are characteristic of the early Christian church that Jung is talking about, we're now going to talk about another way that these showed up, according to Jung, in section 4 of the first chapter on page 26, which is called Nominalism and Realism. Viveki and others have, like, obviously, this is like kind of general history at this point, and we're looking at it through a Jungian lens. So, how are, quote, nominalism and realism expressions of these two different types? Well, first of all, what do we mean by nominalism? Jung says, by nominalism is meant that school which asserted that the so-called universals, namely generic or universal concepts, such as beauty, goodness, animal, man, etc., are nothing but nomina or names, nothing but names or words. So the nominalist is someone who says those things aren't real. They're just words. That if they then there's a quality of it's not real. Whereas the realist, on the contrary, quote, affirms the existence of universals, anti-rem, whatever anti-rem means, and holds that general concepts exist in themselves, in the style of Platonic ideas. So it's a way of saying, no, those yeah, universal concepts, they are real in themselves. So nominalism, by contrast, is a kind of skeptical attitude. Jung says it denies the separate existence characteristic of abstractions. It denies that abstractions point to something that's real. It says, no, those are just words. It's a kind of scientific skepticism coupled with the most rigid dogmatism, nominalism, according to Jung. And therefore, the nominalist conception of reality necessarily coincides with the sensuous reality of things, which makes nominalism associated with the lower of the two categories that we were talking about. So nominalism is an emphasis on everything that's like tangible, real, everything that we can see in front of us. So it has to do with I think I'm going to say the more extroverted of the two categories that Jung is talking about. Whereas strict realism, on the contrary, transfers the accent on reality to the abstract, to a focus on ideas or towards the universal, in a style similar to Plato. So because of this, I think the difference between the nominalist and realist schools of thought, um, as an expression of this deep split in the Christian church, which we're talking about, is the most difficult of the examples or instances of the dichotomy that we've been talking about. For which reason, I'm going to give the example that Jung gives as a way of tying us into the difference between the prehistorical way of experiencing the world that Jung also talks about. So on page 29 and 30. So I'm going to give this an example of the difference between a nominalist and realist that will help me at least understand what it's talking about. So on page 29, quote, this manifest and fundamental opposition was clearly conceived by Gompertz as the problem of inherence and predication. Inherence and predication. So he says, when, for instance, we speak of warm and cold, we speak of warm and cold things, to which warm and cold belong as attributes, predicates, or assertions. So this is going to be an expression of the nominalist point of view. He's sort of saying, when we talk about these more abstract categories like warm or cold, the nominalist is going to say, we're always talking about a warm bottle or a cold bottle. The nominalist would say that warm and cold do not exist in themselves. They exist as predicates, attributes, or qualities of things which actually exist. Yeah, so the assertion refers to something perceived and actually existing, namely to a warm or a cold body. So from that, we get these then arise these abstract categories like warmth and coldness. And so we have this tendency within our way of experiencing the world to thingify, or to reify is the technical philosophical term, where warmth and coldness are then related to as if they were things. So When we talk, we could talk about warmth. We're relating to warmth in the abstract as if warmth were a thing, and this is because of our tendency uh, to make things, to thingify things, to reify things. It's Jung says it's extremely difficult for us to strip the abstraction of its thingness, to strip the abstraction away from its thingness. Um, for there naturally clings to every abstraction the thing it is abstracted from. And then he says, if we now pass to the next higher generic concept. So, for example, what is above? So we went from warm bottle or cold bottle to let's just consider warmth or coldness. So the next step is what if we just considered temperature? Jung still thinks we have no difficulty in perceiving the thingness of temperature itself. So he thinks we still reify things from the from the nominalist in us, let's say. So he's saying that though it has lost its definiteness for the senses, nevertheless it retains the quality of representability that adheres to every sense perception. So we can sort of represent the category of temperature, which we reify as if it were a thing. Then he says, what happens if we go up another level? So he says, if we then ascend to a very much higher generic concept, such as energy, above temperature, he says its thing-like character quite disappears, and with it, to a certain extent, goes the quality of representability. At this point, the conflict arises about the nature of energy. So then the question comes, because energy is much less obviously a thing, what is energy? Is energy purely conceptual and abstract, as the nominalist would say? So the nominalist would say there's energy in me, there's energy in you, there's energy in the world, but these bodies have to exist for energy to exist. Whereas the realist would say, no, energy has a reality in itself. Energy is like a Platonic idea, if you will. Jung is going to give a complex few sentences which may help us, or maybe not, but we can then talk about it. He says, the learned nominalist of our day is quite convinced that energy is nothing but a name, a mere counter in our mental calculus. In spite of this, in our everyday speech, we treat energy as though it were a thing, thus sowing in our heads the greatest confusion from the standpoint of the theory of knowledge. Yes. So we still experience this split between the nominalist and realist ways of approaching reality. Jung then says, the thing likeness of the purely conceptual, which creeps so naturally into the process of abstraction and brings about the reality of the predicate or the abstract idea, is no artificial product, no arbitrary hypostatizing of a concept, but a natural necessity, but a natural necessity. What does Jung mean by that? So Jung is saying that we have this, he's saying that we have a natural inbuilt tendency to combine sensation and the abstract or thinking. So this is a connection in Jung's categories of thinking and sensation, where when we think of a concept such as warmth and coldness, when we can define those concepts, or then temperature, our tendency to sense things then sort of attaches to those concepts which we have derived. So we can start to, we sense warmth, we sense coldness, we sense temperature as if those were actually things, which Jung calls this a natural necessity, this combination of thinking and sensation that leads to realism rather than nominalism. So the realist is in this way someone who is uh, actually more sensitive to the reality of abstract categories or concepts. Jung says it's not that the abstract idea is arbitrarily hypostatized and transplanted into a transcendental world of equally artificial origin. The actual historical process is quite the reverse. So if he's saying it's a natural necessity that we have to do this combination of thinking and sensation, then he's asking the question, how? How does it actually happen? How did this actually originate? And he uses an example from prehistory to illustrate this. I'm not necessarily agreeing with Jung about this, but we're exploring it. He says, among primitives, for instance, the imago, the psychic reverberation of the sense perception, the psychic reverberation of the sense perception is so strong and so sensuously colored that when it is reproduced as a spontaneous memory image, it sometimes even has the quality of an hallucination. So Jung is saying that, yeah, Jung is saying that in prehistory, he's arguing that sense perception was stronger and that this gave easier access to a quality of hallucination. And so he's saying that this is the origin of this sort of realist tendency that we have to combine to sense the uh, to sense abstract categories like warmth and coldness. He's saying that this originated in this prehistoric, strong s sensory faculty. He gives the example, thus, when the memory image of his dead mother suddenly reappears to a primitive, it's it is as if it were her ghost that he sees and hears. We only think of the dead, but we only think of the dead, but the primitive actually perceives them because of the extraordinary sensuousness of his mental images. This explains the primitive's beliefs in ghosts and spirits. They are what we quite simply call thoughts. When the primitive thinks, he literally has visions, whose reality is so great that he constantly mistakes the psychic for the real. So obviously there's a fair bit of prejudice wrapped up in this from Jung, but the important point can get through to us, which is the idea that um there and this is suggestive, right? That there was maybe a much stronger quality of image creation. So it's internal images were maybe much stronger. We could say when there weren't so many microplastics and heavy metals and chemicals, and when we weren't so caught up with reading books for 2000 years, it's pretty reasonable to infer that there may have been a much stronger image creating capacity uh, in people who lived in hunter-gatherer types, for example, that lived around that time. And yeah, their thinking is like much more. Let's assume for the sake of argument that their thinking is much more visual or real in that way. And we experience that in psychedelic states. We get a sense for this, and this is the example that I wanted to draw because Jung is then saying when the primitive thinks, he literally has visions. And who are we to say that's more or less real, right? So a good example of that is comes up in Carlos Castaneda, The Teachings of Don Juan, which I realize is a fictional or at least plagiarized tale. And but the point is that when when the character in that book was learning shamanism, he would have these experiences, and then he would come out with all these silly questions to the shaman, like, "Is it real? Like, did it this vision that I experienced, was it real? Did it really? Was it actual? Did it happen?" And the shaman is just sort of like, "These are silly questions. Like, go deal with your Western sort of prejudice about what's real and what's not, and come back when you're ready to sort of learn from these states." And this is a good example of how for people who experience what in shamanism is called soul flight, this sort of like a ability to go to different places, different times, experience visions. There's a sort of seamless interconnection or boundary dissolving between that reality and this reality. Yeah, and so Jung then says, from this basic fact of the psychic realism and autonomy of the image, vis-a-vis the autonomy of the sense perception, from this basic fact springs the belief in spirits, and not from any need of explanation on the part of the primitive, which is merely imputed to him by Europeans. So yeah, Europeans come along with this, hey, what do you mean by all these spirits? Those aren't real. Like, what are you talking about? And the reason for that, Jung saying, is that the Europeans don't experience that sort of thing because we're so tied up in civilization. Yeah, Jung says, for the primitive, thought is visionary and auditory. Hence, it also has the character of revelation. Thus, the sorcerer, the visionary, is always the thinker of the tribe, who brings about the manifestation of the spirits or gods. I trust that no one listening is offended by all of this prejudice from Jung because he's writing in 19, I don't know, 17 or something like that. But we don't need to keep it today. We can simply make this rather than evaluation and observation of differences in style. So, for example, Jung says primitive superstition surprises us only because we've largely succeeded in decentralizing the psychic image. We've learned to think abstractly, always, of course, with the above mentioned limitations. And so we can simply see that, yeah, I mean, indigenous scholars talk about reading and writing as a major um, impediment, like it's a corruption. And so it's not necessarily clear that having learned to think abstractly is in our favor. Um, that's maybe an argument for a different day, but just to say, yeah, there are maybe advantages and disadvantages. We can learn how to use this faculty well, we hope. Yeah, so Jung then talks about how mystics, like the mystical religious thinker, let's say, can use this uh, can endeavor to recapture this capacity for visionary insight. So it's a uh, extreme sensation coupled with abstraction. So it leads to sort of visions. The mystic can try to recapture this, quote, recapture the primitive reality of the imago by means of an artificial introversion. Then it gives an example of this, which I think is worth quoting. The in the initiation of the Mohammedan mystic Twekelbeg by Mullah Shah. Excuse me for laughing at this person's name, but Twekelbeg relates, quote, after these words, he called me to seat myself opposite to him, while still my senses were as though bemused, and commanded me to create his own image in my inner self. And after he had bound my eyes, he bade me gather all the forces of the soul into my heart. I obeyed, and in the twinkling of an eye, by divine favor and with the spiritual succor of the Sheikh, my heart was opened. I beheld there in my innermost self something resembling an overturned bowl. When this vessel was righted, a feeling of boundless joy flooded through my whole being. I said to the master, from this cell in which I am seated before you, I behold within me a true vision, and it is as though another Twekelbeg was seated before another Molashaf. Yeah, so importantly, this was an example of a mystic initiation that recovered this capacity for a combination of like inner vision, so this imaginal world, just a combination of extraction and sensation, abstraction and sensation leads to internal visions or images. And Jung is saying that this reality of the predicate. So, for example, one might have a vision of the categories that we were talking about earlier, which were warmth and coldness. So, imagine experiencing a mystical vision of warmth or of coldness. I don't know. And he's saying that the reality of the predicate of that warmth or of that coldness category is given a priori since it's always existed in the human mind. So it is real. So Jung is identifying himself as a realist, I guess. He says only by subsequent criticism is the abstraction deprived of the quality of reality. Yeah, he says even in Plato's time, the belief in the magical reality of verbal concepts was so great that it was worth the philosopher's while to devise traps or fallacies by which he was able, through the absolute significance of words, to elicit an absurd reply. That's not that helpful to us, but what we're exploring here is, yes, the idea that sort of over time, the nominalist perspective came to dominate, and so we became more abstract, and our abstractions, our thoughts, had less of a quality of sensation. They were less visionary, less we couldn't see what we thought of. Our thought became more abstract, and this went along with a tendency towards nominalism rather than realism. Realism would say, no, those things are real because we can sense them, and this is an introverted realism in the Platonic sense is connected with introversion, whereas nominalism, in a sense of coming down back to the things that we can actually see, this is an extroverted tendency exemplified, let's say, by Aristotle. At least, at least in contradistinction to Plato. I realize that's an oversimplification, but that's fine for the moment. Yeah, there is an important section here that I want to talk about so this is in relation to nominalism as an expression of extroversion and realism, let's say, as an expression of introversion. And yeah, so Plato as an expression of the introverted realist, um, who believes that our abstract qualities, the ideas, the Platonic ideals, do actually exist. This is the Platonic by nature. So as a result of the development of nominalism, I think, as a result, the reality of the generic concept, which in the form of the Platonic idea had a metaphysical existence and exclusive validity, was put in jeopardy. So Gompertz says, men were not as yet possessed of that distrust of language which animates us moderns, and frequently causes us to see in words a far from adequate expression of the facts. On the contrary, there was a simple and unsuspecting faith that the range of an idea and the range of the word, roughly corresponding to it, must in every case exactly coincide. This is a very complicated way of saying it, but um, yeah, so he's saying that there was a sophist critique which was put up as against Platonism. So this offered a striking, which offered a striking proof of the impotence of language. So yeah, so this sort of the way that this is nominalist is sort of saying that yeah, but those ideas, those words don't actually point to something real. Um, there's a sort of undermining of the absolute within the absolute power of language. So Jung says, insofar as ideas are merely names, the supposition that remains to be proved. The attack upon Plato was justified. But generic concepts cease to be mere names when they designate the similarities or conformities of things. The question then arises whether these conformities are objective realities or not. These conformities actually exist, hence the generic concept also corresponds with some kind of reality. It contains as much reality as does the exact description of a thing. The generic concept differs from the description only in that it describes or designates the conformities of things. The weakness, therefore, lies neither in the generic concept nor in the Platonic idea, but in its verbal expression, which obviously under no circumstances adequately reproduces either the thing or its conformity. So I know that's a complicated way of putting it. He just says the nominalist attack on the doctrine of ideas was thus in principle an unwarrantable encroachment, and Plato's exasperated counterstroke was fully justified. So Jung is identifying himself with Platonism here in a sense of saying there's a way that the sophists were it brought down the power of language. The sophists said, yeah, but this um, sophistry sort of proves the impotence of language in describing these the more abstract realities, whereas a Platonic or let's say philosophical valuation of language and saying language can actually point to the absolute significance of words. Um, uh, what is it about that? So the so the sophists sort of point to a weakness, and the question is, the sophists went too far in pushing back on Plato and more towards this like nominalist devaluation of language, let's say. So how did they go too far? And Jung is saying it's that the weakness lies in these complex categories, these complex abstract realities, we could say hyper objects, these complex abstract realities which have to do with the similarities or conformities of things, something like warmth, for example. Um, he's saying that the sophists point to a weakness, but what is that weakness? He's saying it doesn't lie in the concept itself. So it's not that there's a problem with the concept warmth, nor in the Platonic idea, but in its verbal expression. So this is pointing to this. What this implies is that there could be a verbal expression which could adequately uh, reveal, disclose the reality of hyperobjects. So, which is in a sense the entire point of philosophy, at least in the Platonic tradition, is to. I mean, I'm getting shades of Pythagorean mystery schools here as well. It's sort of this whole purpose of the logos of a sort of invocatory, incantory, incantory speech is to sort of evoke the sensuousness of these abstract categories and make them shown to be real in the realist sense, rather than the nominalist, who, as Jung said, is more of a dogmatist and a skeptic, who um, sort of has a skeptical attitude and says, no, we can't. Language doesn't work that way, and they profane language in that way, we could say. Yeah. So Jung's talking about he's actually talking about cynicism, but anyway, he says that to this essentially critical attitude of mind, Plato's world of ideas with their eternal reality stands diametrically opposed. And so we're dealing with these two categories of this like orientation towards unity here by language and by realism, by Platonism, as opposed to an orientation towards the sensory, toward everything that we can see with our senses, everything that is multiple, everything that's here in front of us, and a sort of disbelief in the power of language. And Jung says both forms of judgment are justifiable, um, as both are naturally present in every man. So they come from different types of people. And he says this is best seen, in my view, from the fact that the very founder of the Megarian school, Euclides of Megara, established an all oneness that was immeasurably far above the individual and particular. For he linked together the Eleatic principle of being with good, so that for him being and good were identical. As opposed to this, there was only a non-existing, non-being, non-existing evil. And so this is a sort of, in a way, it's sort of Neoplatonic in a sense. It's a Neoplatonic compensation or counteraction to the tendencies exemplified by nominalism and cynicism and the sophists, let's say. Then we get this this distinction between being and good, and sort of unity, um, which is very much like the Neoplatonic one, versus this like non-existing evil, which Jung is now going to have an issue with. He says this optimistic all oneness was, of course, nothing but a generic concept of the highest order, one that simply included being, but at the same time contradicted all evidence of evil, that is. Far more so even than the Platonic ideas. With his concept, Euclides produced a compensation for the negatively critical dissolution of constructive judgments into mere verbalities. Yeah, so this is like what I was saying. He says, though, this is an important section, which is why I'm reading it. His all oneness was so remote and so vague that it utterly failed to express the conformity of things. It was no type at all, but rather the product of a desire for a unity that would embrace the disordered multitude of individual things. This is really important because this is if we wish to side with Plato and with the realist take, and say that no, we can have this combination of abstraction and sensation that points to the reality uh, of these concepts like warmth and coldness were the examples that we used, then we have to know how. We have to know how to use our language, our expression in such a way that can evoke them, that can bring them into uh, our visionary awareness, let's say, into our sensory awareness. And he's saying that the if we simply just name them, if we name, oh, there is a one which is being and good, this naming is an inadequate expression to it becomes so remote and so vague that it utterly failed to express the conformity of things. It was no type at all, but rather the product of a desire for a unity. That's why, again, the mirror of Erised ends up being really important because this desire is actually secondary. That desire, adhering to that desire, is actually a form of idolatry. But anyway, desire for a unity that would embrace the disordered multitude of individual things. This desire forces itself on all those who pay homage to extreme nominalism, insofar as they make any attempt to escape from their negatively critical attitude. Hence, it's not uncommon to find in people of this sort an idea of fundamental uniformity that is superlatively improbable and arbitrary. It's manifestly impossible to base oneself entirely on this principle of inherence. And he gives some quotes from Gompertz, which I'd like to quote in this vein. Gompertz observes, so this is a tendency toward vague unity and goodness that is an insufficient linguistic expression of the combination of thinking and sensation in mystical visions. Gompertz says, attempts of this nature are foredoomed to failure in every age. Their success was completely out of the question in an age that was destitute of historical understanding, and in which there was next to no insight into the deeper problems of psychology. It was not a mere risk, it was an absolute certainty that the more patent and palpable, but on the whole less important, values would be thrust into the background, others of greater moment. Though less easily discerned. In taking the brute and the savage for a model in their efforts to lop off the excrescences of civilization, men laid a destroying hand upon much that was the fruit of an ascending process of development, which must be measured in myriads of years. Not the clearest. I think the next one is clearer. Anyway, Jung then says he refers to constructive judgment, which is this like yeah, this Platonic quality of which is actually constructive judgment is based on the conformity of things. So it does uh, recognize the absolute reality of what our language refers to, this combination of thinking and sensation, um, has created general ideas that must be counted among the highest values of civilization. Quote, even if these ideas relate only to the dead, we're nevertheless still bound to them by threads, which, as Gompertz says, have gained an almost unbreakable strength. So with this quote, Jung is doing a couple of things. Jung is actually taking the point of view, obviously, of a naturalist in the sense of someone who talks about, hey, don't just say there's being and good together because we're beset with the reality of evil all around. This is why he's a Gnostic rather than a Christian. He's also saying we can do the Platonic thing of like talking about the sensory or sensuous reality of our abstract categories. Um, he thinks that we can do this with the expression of our language, but he's relating it specifically to the dead. And so this allows Jung to do two things. One of them is to validate the experiences which are described in the introduction to the Red Book, which I've published on, and his Seven Sermons to the Dead, which is basically he experienced the presence of the dead in his house. And so that this harks back to the what he calls like the experiences of the primitives. And so there's like among indigenous peoples worldwide, we can say that the dead are far, like ancestor worship, let's say, it's far more of a like experienced reality, like because in a way we think that the dead are not real as modern Western people, and Jung is sort of saying um, even if this combination of like abstraction and sensation and visionary and mystical experience, even if these ideas relate only to the dead, we're nevertheless still bound to them, which of course he would think because he's a naturalist, like valuing the what I mean by that is like he is saying, hey, we need to go back, we need to compensate for the dissociated, overly abstract uh, values of modern civilizations and recover this capacity that we have lost. And he also experienced that himself in the form of these mystical visions of the dead, let's say. And he then quotes Gompertz again, who says, yeah, he's saying this again, this combination of abstract and sensation, even if these ideas relate only to the dead, we're nevertheless still bound to them by threads, which, as Gompertz says, have gained an almost unbreakable strength. He continues, thus it is with the body bereft of life. But things which never possessed life may also have a claim on our forbearance, our reverence, even our self-sacrificing devotion. For example, statues, graves, the soldier's flag. And if we do violence to our nature, if we succeed in breaking by main force the bonds of association, we lapse into savagery. We suffer injury in our own souls by the loss of all those feelings which, so to speak, clothe the hard bedrock of naked reality with a garniture of verdant life. On the maintenance of these overgrowths of sentiment, on the due treasuring of acquired values, depend all the refinement, the beauty, and the grace of life, all ennobling of the animal instincts, together with all enjoyment and the pursuit of art, all, in short, that the cynics set themselves to root up without scruple and without pity. There is, no doubt, a limit, so much we may readily concede to them, and they're not inconsiderable imitators of the present day, beyond which we cannot allow ourselves to be ruled by the principle of association without incurring the charge of that same folly and superstition, which quite certainly grew out of the unlimited sway of that principle. Yeah. So the reason that we've spent so much time on this is because this problem has never been set at rest. So Jung is then going to talk about this like this is the problem of inherence and predication, which we talked about between um, sort of nominalists and realists, who like yeah, personality types, let's say, that are have very different metaphysics, very different expressions of uh, what constitutes reality, and different beliefs. Um, he says that question of the among the scholastics was never set at rest. Um, and so for here, the question at issue is the typical opposition between the abstract standpoint, where the decisive value lies in the mental process itself, and on the other hand, the personal thinking and feeling, which whether consciously or unconsciously underlie orientation by the objects of sense. So this then becomes the main difference, which is it's essentially the thinking versus feeling in a sense. But there's clearly a connection here between sort of the abstraction process and introversion, which sort of comes through from Platonism. And on the other hand, um, yeah, feeling and sensation and the objects rather than the subject. So extraversion, orientation toward the object. Um, so Jung then uses these historical examples to develop his system of typology, which is definitely like this is just Jung's take on typology, right? And but that is a part of what we're exploring. He first of all withholds judgment on whether Plato is an introvert or extrovert, which we could just leave that behind. But then he says like he's wanting to say that it's not that introversion and thinking always go together because he's saying introversion and feeling can be associated, and extroversion too doesn't have to be just like if it's not just like this typical introverted thinking, extroverted feeling. It could be uh, introverted feeling and let's say extroverted thinking would be the other category that we might overlook if we were offering a more simplistic typology. Yes, he then situates this discussion that we were just having about inherence and prediction as connected to nominalism and realism. Sorry, predication, not prediction. Nominalism and realism. He then situates that discussion within this uh, development of the theory of types. And so he says, we have therefore to class the particular conflict between the principles of inherence and predication as a special case, which he's going to investigate further later. But then he says, the special nature of this case lies in the positive and negative parts played by personal feeling. I'm going to then read what he says and then talk about it. He says, when the type, the generic concept, reduces the individual thing to a shadow, the type has acquired the reality of a collective idea. But when the value of the individual thing abolishes the type, generic concept, anarchic disintegration is at work. Both positions are extreme and unfair, but they form a contrasting picture whose clear outlines, by their very exaggeration, throw into relief features which, in a milder and more covert form, are also inherent in the nature of the introverted and extroverted types, even in the case of individuals in whom personal feeling is not pushed into the foreground. What he's saying here is that this in any case of these pairs of opposites that we've been talking about, for example, nominalism and realism, the extremes in either case are revealed to be dysfunctional. And that comes with deep consequences, which is why Jung is then going to talk about holding the tension between pairs of opposites, between symbols as it having a unifying function, and the transcendent function, which is able to work with that tension as a form of creativity, and importantly, the logos as a producer of symbols is and especially ecstatic and visionary speech was also already alluded to in the discussion of realism. But the important point here was that there's a way that the realists, so let's say Plato, for example. I'm just using Plato, like maybe that's going to annoy some people. I don't really care. When Plato, when the type reduces the individual thing to a shadow, so this is where the emphasis of on this is different emphasis on reality as connected with our personal feeling. So a person who was more of a yes, an introvert and a realist might think and feel that the type, so the generic concept, the general category, like warmth or coldness we were using before, is more real. And the individual things, for example, so like for Plato, for example, the type of the Platonic idea horse, the category horse, let's say, he might think that's more real. And an individual horse he might feel is devalued in contrast to the type. So Jung says when the value on the type reduces the individual thing, the individual horse, for example, to a shadow, the type has acquired the reality of a collective idea. The other way around would be when the value of the individual thing, the individual horse, abolishes the type, for example, the Platonic idea of the horse, anarchic disintegration is at work. And so there are risks at both ends. Like so with the realist, for example, we can see how that could quickly become uh, tyranny or totalitarianism, where like if for example, Nazism, we can see how the Germans in a totalitarian, authoritarian, fascistic state, there's a devaluation of the individual and an overvaluation of the collective idea, which Jung calls the spirit of Wotan, right? This is a kind of collective possession, sort of like the collective idea is more real, more important. Whereas the opposite is the sort of so that's the sort of pathology of order kind of extreme. And whereas the other way would be to overvalue individual things at the expense of the unity which can combine them, which looks like anarchic disintegration. And so we're basically wanting to find what is how can the logos serve as a mediating function between the two typologies? And just in passing to note here, when we've established a way of life where different members of these different kinds of typologies can hang out together and talk, this is how we get things going wrong. I think like there's a depth sociology that is implied by oppositions of this type, where we need um, to in some way recreate, like Jordan Hall's Civium project is a great idea of this, to recreate a tribal scale of living where, importantly, there was, let's say, appropriate represent. I mean, it sounds like a postmodernist now, but appropriate representation of meaningful diversity, meaning diversity among different ways of experiencing reality. Like, and we could measure typology as a way of doing that. And just to say that it was connected with this Christian difference between the original sin, so like overvaluing of the transcendent or superpersonal compared to the undervaluing of the personal, the humans. And the contrast is this sense of human freedom, human dignity, human autonomy, um, versus the inaccessibility of God or something like that. And um, our self-regard, our how we regard ourselves, how we regard the personal, is going to be critically important in what follows. Why? Because Jung says, yeah, so we're talking about the difference between mental and feeling, so abstraction and feeling here, so thinking and feeling. And Jung says, for instance, it makes a considerable difference whether the mental function is master or servant. The master thinks and feels differently from the servant. Even the most far-reaching abstraction of the personal in favor of the general value can never quite eliminate the personal admixtures. This is a confession, Jung saying that his personal stuff is present in the material. And insofar as these exist, thinking and feeling, yeah, will contain destructive tendencies that come from the self-assertion of the person in the face of unfavorable social conditions. He's saying that there is a quality of disintegration which sort of seems to inhere within the presence of personal material versus maybe an integrating tendency which is present in with impersonal material. I'm not sure I agree with that, but in any case, I'm going to pause.